don't know how they did it. All I know is they did it. I don't think anybody knows how they did it, how they lifted those stones, how they brought them up to that level. I think we're looking, again, at a lost technology.
Buried deep in the mountains of southern Siberia is a wall that should not exist. Giant granite blocks, stacked on top of each other, stretching nearly 200 meters across a mountain summit. Each block weighing up to 4,000 tons. The largest stones at Baalbek in Lebanon, the ones that defeated the greatest engineers of the Roman Empire, weigh 800 tons each.
That the ones that were installed were not built by the Romans, but the ones that were quarried were made by the Romans. They were trying to quarry out stones to match it.
The blocks in Siberia are 5 times that weight. They sat hidden behind Soviet military checkpoints for most of the 20th century, sealed away from the world. When they were finally discovered in 2013, the ground around them showed burn marks, violently displaced boulders, and magnetic disturbances that instruments could not explain. Science has no answer for what created them. The silence. Why the world never knew. Deep in southern Siberia, there is a mountain range that the rest of the world forgot existed for nearly an entire century. Not because it was empty, but because the Soviet Union made sure nobody could get close enough to find out. From the 1920s through to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Kemerovo region of southern Russia was sealed off. Military checkpoints sat across every road leading into those mountains. Foreign scientists were turned away. Independent researchers were refused entry. The official reason was industrial security. Coal had been discovered in the region, then iron. The Soviet government declared the entire area restricted and kept it that way for decades, but industry was not the only reason the world was kept out. The Kemerovo region was also one of the most heavily controlled Gulag territories in the entire Soviet Union. A gulag was a forced labor camp where the Soviet government sent prisoners, many of them innocent people accused of political crimes, to work in brutal conditions until they died. Hundreds of thousands of people perished in those valleys. The Soviet government could not afford foreign eyes anywhere near what was happening in that region. Soviet geological teams did survey the area during the 1960s and 1970s. They had equipment and detailed maps. They moved through the mountain range searching for coal and iron deposits. Which means it is entirely possible that at least one Soviet scientist climbed high enough to see those formations, wrote a report, and filed it somewhere it was never meant to be found. That report has never surfaced. If it exists, nobody is talking. At the same time the mountains were being locked away, the one group of people who knew them best was being silenced. The Shore people are an indigenous Turkic community who had lived in these valleys since at least the 6th century. For over 1,000 years, they passed stories down from parent to child about this land and what to stay away from. Under Soviet rule, their language was banned. Their cultural gatherings were shut down. Their children were forced to speak Russian and forget everything their grandparents had taught them. Whatever the Shore knew about that mountain was being erased at the same time the mountain was being sealed from the outside world. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the checkpoints came down. But the damage was already done. The roads were poor. The forests were brutal to cross in winter. The region spent most of the 1990s ignored and economically broken. By the time serious explorers began entering those peaks, an entire generation of knowledge had been lost. A mountain sat on an open ridgeline visible to anyone who climbed high enough in a country with scientists and geological institutions, and nobody examined it for the better part of a century. Not because it was hidden, because the people in charge made sure no one was allowed to look, but in 2013, one man finally looked. And what he found at that summit was something the world was completely unprepared for. The discovery. Georgy Sidorov was a Russian researcher and writer who had spent years collecting reports about strange formations deep in the Shoria mountain range of southern Siberia. The reports were vague, second-hand, passed between locals and hikers who had caught glimpses of something unusual at high elevation. Most people ignored them, Sidorov did not. In 2013, he organized a small expedition and led his team into the wilderness toward the summit of a peak inside the range called Mount William. The journey took hours on foot. There were no proper roads at that altitude, no trail markers, no infrastructure of any kind, just dense Siberian forest pressing in from every side and a cold so deep it settled into the bones and stayed there. The mountain did not make it easy to arrive. Several members of the team later said something strange happened before they even reached the summit. A feeling began to settle over them. Not exhaustion from the climb, not nerves about the terrain. Something else. A deep, instinctive unease that none of them could explain or point to. Nobody said anything during the ascent, but when the team compared notes afterward, every single person had felt it independently. The closer they got to the summit, the more the mountain seemed to push back. Then they came around a ridge, and the wall appeared. What they saw stopped every one of them in their tracks. Rising from the summit, ridgeline were granite blocks of a size that none of them had ever stood beside in their lives. These were not boulders. They were stacked, one on top of another, reaching heights that Sidorov measured at roughly 40 meters in certain sections. To put that in perspective, 40 meters is taller than a 10-story building. The blocks stretched along the ridgeline for close to 200 meters. The upper surfaces of the blocks were flat. Not roughly flat the way broken stone sometimes appears from a distance, but genuinely consistently level. And the corners were not worn down or softened by centuries of weather. They were sharp and crisp, the kind of edges you find on stone that has been deliberately shaped, not on rock that has been split by frost and rain over thousands of years. Standing beside those blocks, the members of Sidorov's team looked like small children standing next to a building where the ground floor alone was 5 meters high. The summit where all of this sat had no name on any modern Russian survey map. A peak containing structures of this scale had never been formally identified or catalogued in Russian geography. It did not appear in any official record. It had simply been sitting there on an open ridgeline, unnamed and unexamined, for a length of time nobody could calculate. Sidorov's team photographed everything they could reach, multiple angles, multiple sections of the wall, written observations, field measurements. When they came back down and released the images, the photographs spread across the world within days. People everywhere stopped and stared at them. Researchers, historians, archaeologists, and geologists all saw them, and the debate that followed was immediate and loud. But the Russian scientific community did not take the discovery seriously. They laughed it off. No scientist went to the mountain to check. No investigation was launched. No measurements were taken. The rejection came before anyone had done any actual work. And that is strange, because when experts dismiss something this significant this quickly, without even looking at it, you have to ask why. But to understand the true weight of what Sidorov's team had found, you need to understand the numbers. Because the size of those blocks does not just stretch the imagination, it breaks it entirely. The scale that breaks everything. In medieval Europe, the stones used to build castle walls weighed between 2 and 10 tons each. Moving them required organized teams of laborers, thick ropes, wooden pulleys, and months of careful effort. A 10-ton stone was considered a serious and difficult undertaking. That was the ceiling of what ordinary ancient builders could manage. The ancient Egyptians worked at a different level entirely. The largest stones inside the Great Pyramid of Giza weigh around 80 tons each. To move them, the Egyptians used the Nile River as a highway, floating stone across long distances on wooden barges. They had tens of thousands of workers and one of the most organized governments the ancient world had ever produced. And even with all of that, building a single pyramid took decades. Then there is Baalbek. In the country of Lebanon, there is an ancient temple complex where 3 stone blocks sit in the foundation beneath the Roman columns. These blocks are called the trilithon. Each one weighs approximately 800 tons. When Roman engineers arrived and found them already in place, they did not attempt to move them. The Romans built roads across continents and carried water over mountain ranges through stone channels. But 800 tons was beyond anything their technology could handle. They designed their entire temple around those blocks rather than touch them. And then, in 2014, a fourth stone was discovered still sitting in the ancient quarry at Baalbek, exactly where it was cut from the earth thousands of years ago. It weighs an estimated 1,650 tons. It was never moved, not 1 meter. The workers who cut it from the ground eventually walked away and left it there because they had no way to transport it. That abandoned stone is currently considered the largest quarried block in all of recorded human history. Now consider Sharia. The blocks at Mount Sharia are estimated to weigh between 1,000 and 4,000 tons each. The wall contains dozens of them. The smaller blocks at Sharia are already heavier than the Baalbek trilithon that defeated Roman engineering. The largest blocks at Sharia are more than double the weight of the stone that ancient workers abandoned in their own quarry because they could not move it. And modern technology offers no comfort here. The Liebherr LTM 11200 is one of the most powerful mobile cranes ever built. Under perfect conditions on flat engineered ground, it can lift a maximum of around 1,200 tons. The smaller blocks at Sharia would already push past that limit. The largest ones would require more than 3 times the lifting capacity of the most powerful crane humanity has ever constructed. These blocks could not be moved today, not without technology that does not yet exist. Then add the location. Baalbek sits on a flat plain. Giza sits beside a river. Both ancient sites had geography working in their favor. Sharia sits at nearly 4,000 feet of elevation in one of the most isolated and punishing mountain environments on the planet. No river, no ancient road network, no quarry site anywhere in the surrounding area. Nobody has found where the stone came from. Nobody has explained how it reached the summit. If any civilization moved those blocks, the workforce required would have been the largest ever assembled in human history. And yet the entire region around Mount Sharia has produced not a single artifact suggesting any organized group ever lived or worked there. No tools, no graves, no settlements, no pottery fragments, nothing. The blocks are there. Everything that should accompany them is not. The official explanation says no civilization moved them. It says nature did. So let us look at that explanation directly and let us watch what happens when the evidence is held against it. The geological argument, and where it breaks down. Scientists have a name for what they believe created those blocks. It is called freeze-thaw cycling, and the explanation goes like this. Water finds its way into the tiny natural cracks inside a granite rock. In winter, that water freezes. Frozen water expands, and that expansion slowly pushes the crack wider. In spring, the water melts, and in winter it freezes again, pushing a little wider each time. This cycle repeats for centuries. Eventually, the granite splits along those cracks. The softer rock between the splits crumbles and washes away, and what remains are large rectangular blocks sitting where the surrounding material used to be. These formations are called tors, and they exist on mountains across the world, in Scotland, in Australia, in South Africa. They can look dramatic and angular from a distance. The geological explanation is real, and it is not something to dismiss lightly. But the blocks at Sharia have details that this process cannot produce. And those details matter. Look at the corners first. When granite splits naturally through centuries of freezing and thawing, the same weather that creates the split also attacks the exposed edges. Over time, those edges wear down. The corners soften and round off the way all exposed rock surfaces do after thousands of years of wind, ice, and rain. Walk up to any naturally formed granite tor in Scotland or Australia and you will see it. Rounded edges, softened angles. That is what weather does to stone over a long period of time, but the corners at Sharia are not rounded. They are sharp and clean, holding their angle the way a block of stone holds it when someone has deliberately cut it. Weather does not produce that. Weather destroys it. Those sharp corners should not exist on a natural formation that has been sitting through Siberian winters for thousands of years. Then look at the surfaces. When granite fractures naturally, the cracks follow the internal stress lines running through the rock, and those lines run in multiple directions. The resulting faces are angular but uneven and irregular. That is what naturally broken granite looks like up close. But the upper surfaces of the Sharia blocks are flat and level in a way that is consistent across several meters of stone. Geologists who have spent their careers studying natural tor formations have pointed out that this kind of consistent, flat, horizontal surface is not something the freeze-thaw process produces. The mechanics simply do not work that way. Flat surfaces that run evenly across that kind of distance do not come from splitting rock. They come from shaping it. And then there is the most uncomfortable detail of all. The Soviet geological classification of these formations was never based on anyone actually visiting those specific blocks. It was based on regional survey maps. A team of geologists studied the broader area, drew their conclusions about the mountain range as a whole, and applied those conclusions to Mount William without sending anyone to the summit to examine those specific formations directly. No samples were taken from those blocks. No instruments were placed against them. The entire official explanation rests on an assumption that has never been tested at this location. Several geologists who were privately shown Sidorov's photographs said quietly that what they were seeing did not match any natural tor formation in their experience. None of them said it publicly, because there is no formal published study of Sharia for them to respond to. The official scientific conversation about this site has never actually begun, which means it has also never been officially challenged. A small team with the right equipment could settle this permanently in a single field season. Map the internal fracture lines, sample the rock directly, measure the surfaces, publish the results. The question gets answered and the debate ends. That has not happened. Not in 11 years. Not one published paper. Not one field measurement from the actual site. The official explanation is built on maps, not on evidence. And the shape of those blocks is only the beginning of what it cannot account for. The anomalies. Something is wrong with this place. On the descent from the summit, someone on Sidorov's team looked down at their compass and stopped walking. The needle was not pointing north. It was moving, swinging toward the stone wall behind them. The person next to them checked their own compass. Same thing. Then everyone checked. Every compass in the group was behaving the same way. The needles were not drifting slightly off course the way a compass might drift near certain mineral deposits. They were actively deflecting, pulled by something radiating from the wall itself. One explanation exists for this kind of magnetic disturbance near granite. Some granite contains a mineral called magnetite, which is naturally magnetic and can pull a compass needle away from true north when you are standing close to a large deposit of it. That is a documented and real geological phenomenon, but magnetite works evenly. When a large granite formation contains magnetite, the magnetic disturbance is spread across the whole formation in a pattern that follows the natural crystal structure of the rock. What Sidorov's team experienced was not even. The deflection was strongest near specific block faces, particularly the faces that appeared flattest and most precisely shaped. Move away from those faces and the needle settled. Move back toward them and it pulled again. Different faces of the same wall were producing different magnetic behavior. That is not what magnetite does. A natural mineral deposit does not concentrate its magnetic effect on the most geometrically precise surfaces of a structure and leave the rest of the formation comparatively quiet. And the compass needles were not the only things responding. Several members of the team began experiencing severe headaches near those same sections of the wall, not gradually. Suddenly, one team member described a pressure building inside their skull. Another described their thinking becoming slow and heavy, the way it feels when something is pressing on your head from the outside. These symptoms appeared near specific blocks, the same blocks where the compass deflection was strongest, and eased when those people moved away. Their bodies were reacting to something localized in those sections of the wall, something that instruments were only partly capturing. Then the team found the burn marks. These were not patches of discoloration from lichen or long exposure to weather. Lichen grows on stone and leaves staining, and anyone who works with old stone knows what that looks like. This was different. These were sections of the stone face where the granite itself had melted and then hardened again. The crystals inside the rock had fused together into a glassy, smooth surface. That process is called vitrification, and it requires temperatures above 1,000 degrees Celsius. To give that number real meaning, the surface of flowing volcanic lava reaches between 700 and 1,200 degrees Celsius. Whatever created those marks on the surface of those blocks generated heat at the level of a volcanic event. There is nothing in the natural geological profile of that mountain capable of producing that. Not lightning, not friction, not any weather event associated with a Siberian forest. Vitrified stone is not unique to Sharia. Ancient stone forts in Scotland have been found with walls partially melted and fused into glass. Certain rock formations in the Atacama Desert in South America show the same phenomenon. Nobody has produced a consensus explanation for any of those sites. At Sharia, nobody has collected a single sample from those burned surfaces for laboratory analysis. The evidence is sitting there in open air, visible to any researcher willing to make the climb, and not one scientific study has touched it. And then there are the displaced blocks. Spread up to 500 meters away from the main wall are pieces of granite weighing hundreds of tons, sitting at distances and in positions that no gradual geological process accounts for. Erosion moves surface material slowly and in predictable directions. Glacial movement leaves specific patterns and trails behind it. Neither process picks up a block weighing hundreds of tons and deposits it 500 meters away on a mountain ridgeline. Whatever moved those blocks did it with a force that geology has no category for. The way they are positioned, the distances they traveled, the absence of any trail or drag mark behind them, points to one conclusion that most people do not want to write down. They were thrown. Something happened on that mountain. Something that melted stone, warped magnetic fields in localized patches, and hurled blocks that weigh as much as a fleet of aircraft across a ridgeline. Whatever it was, it left its marks everywhere. And underneath all of it, Sidorov's team discovered something that no instrument they carried was designed to detect. The energy, the legends, and the unanswered question. When members of Sidorov's team talked about what they felt standing beside the largest blocks, they struggled to find words that fit. It was not a sound. It was not a vibration they could hear or a temperature they could measure. It was a pressure, a physical sensation rising from beneath the stone, pushing upward as though something had been compressed deep inside the rock for an enormous amount of time, and was still pressing outward against the weight holding it down. Several people described it the same way, independently, without comparing notes in the moment. It felt like standing on something that was still alive. The sensation was not spread evenly across the site. Just like the compass deflections and the sudden headaches, it was concentrated near the largest blocks and strongest near the faces that appeared most precisely shaped. The parts of the wall that made the least sense geologically were the same parts that produced the strongest physical response in the people standing beside them. Whatever was generating that feeling was not coming from the mountain in general. It was coming from specific places inside the stone. To understand why this matters, you have to know something about the people who lived beneath this mountain long before any researcher arrived. The shore people settled in these mountain valleys over 1,000 years ago. For generation after generation, they watched these peaks from the valleys below and passed their knowledge of the land down through stories and songs and warnings. They knew this territory the way only people who have lived somewhere for centuries can know it. And part of what they knew was that certain mountains in their range were not places the living were meant to enter. The shore did not describe those mountains as holy. They did not build temples on them or make offerings at their base. They avoided them. The language they used to explain why was specific and consistent across generations. They described forces inside certain mountains as dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary physical danger like avalanches or unstable ground. The danger they described was of a different nature entirely, something that human beings were simply not built to survive being near. The Altai shamanic tradition, which is closely related to shore spiritual belief and comes from the same ancient Central Asian roots, goes further. It contains detailed accounts of specific mountains that function not as sacred sites but as sealed containers. The word used is important, not sacred, sealed. These were places where something had been deliberately locked away at a point so far back in time that no living tradition remembered when it happened or by whom. The warnings attached to these mountains were not ceremonial. They were operational. Do not go there. Do not disturb what has been closed. Do not let out what has been contained. The language those traditions used across centuries, sealed mountains, trapped force, stone that holds, is the same language Sidorov's team reached for independently in 2013 when they tried to describe what they felt standing beside those blocks. An ancient oral tradition and a modern research expedition, separated by 1,000 years, arriving at the same description from completely different directions. That alignment does not dissolve easily. The shore oral traditions that survived into the modern era are fragmentary because of the Soviet suppression that nearly destroyed them, which means that whatever specific knowledge the shore carried about Mount William, whatever name they gave it and whatever warning they attached to that name, may have been lost in the decades when their culture was being dismantled. The mountain may have had a shore name that told you exactly what it was. That name may no longer exist anywhere. 11 years have passed since those photographs reached the world. In that time, not one peer-reviewed team has published a technical survey of the formations at Mount William. Not one field measurement. Not one published result of any kind. Researchers who pushed for a formal investigation described running into quiet, consistent resistance. Funding that never came through. Support that was promised and then disappeared. If those blocks are natural, one small team with basic equipment settles this in a single field season. That has not happened. And that absence, more than the burn marks, more than the thrown blocks, more than the compass needles pulling toward specific stone faces, is the detail that sits heaviest. The shore knew something was wrong with that mountain for 1,000 years. The world has had 11 years to find out what it is. It has chosen, without explanation, not to look.